Good morning. We're back to the children of Green Knowe. And I'm sorry I haven't read a story to you for a couple of days. I've been a bit under, and how exciting it was when he sang in a masque for King Charles II, and how the king gave him his first flute. And that's the flute that Tolly has now. You may not remember that before she told the story, Mrs. Oldknow said that she was worried that it might freeze that night because it was very, very cold. And you know what? By the next morning, it had. So here we go. Mrs. Oldknow's fears were justified. It did freeze that night. The air sang with frost as Toseland lay in bed, and the birds roosted in his hospitable branches. The owls hooted outside. Their sounds seemed to echo from a glassy, frost-hard sky. Tolly could literally hear how wide the meadows were. He was dropping off to sleep, and already his waking thoughts were mixed with dreams of an echoing palace inhabited by a man with eyes like a parrot, when a direful shriek startled him and he huddled in bed, wide awake. An owl had come close to the window, perching on the gutter with his ogre claws. His voice sounded almost in the room. The birds twittered with fright, the mouse squeaked, and so, if the truth be told, did Tolly, pulling the bedclothes up over his ears. It was with an effort of get ready for Christmas. There are only a few days left. Can we give them a present? Said Tolly. Well, what would you suggest? On the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a partridge in a pear tree. Tolly was thinking aloud. I think that would be perfect, but a little difficult. Not absolutely impossible. It would be difficult to get a live partridge and harder to make it stay in the tree. It ought really to be a tame one. It could be in a cage, and we could tame it afterwards. I'm sure they'd never had a partridge. Linnet would love it, with all its brood running after it like tortoiseshell thimbles with legs. Let's try, Tolly. It's a perfect idea. We'll advertise. Wanted, live hen partridge, preferably tame. And I'll write to a gamekeeper I know in Scotland. Bring me my writing. Enjoyed themselves writing what seemed ridiculous letters. They also chose out of a catalogue a pear tree described as having juicy, melting flesh, delicious flavour. While they were writing, Boggis brought in some magazines and a note from a neighbour who offered to drive Mrs. Oldknow into Great Church if she had anything to do there, and also to take her to a concert. That means I can't take you, Tolly. What a shame. But we'll go another time together. Boggis will have to look after you. Please thank her, Boggis, and say I'll be ready at 11. What are those papers? Oh, something about the house, Mum, that she thought might interest you. Mrs. Oldknow, with her baskets for the Christmas shopping, went off in her friend's car. Tolly went out into the garden. The snow, first melted and then frozen over, looked messy, lifeless and uninviting. There was thin ice on the moat, not strong enough to bear his weight. He went to the fish platform and broke the ice there, clearing a pool and throwing bread in. Neptune's ugly snout with whiskers made of flesh like sea anemones came and sucked it in. But Tolly could not love Neptune. Mrs. Oldknow said that when he was young, he was almost as pretty as a goldfish. Tolly fed him for Toby's sake, but thought he was horrid. Turning away from the pool, he looked around for the tree that during the snow had been like a snowman, the tree called Green Knowe. He was startled to find himself so near it. In the tangle of briars, saplings and brushwood, which the wood path that he had so often followed skirted at a careful distance, stood a tall yew column, roughly shaped like Noah, with his usual square shoulders and fantastic flat bowler hat. It was not surprising that Tolly had not noticed it before, because it was so long since it had been trimmed that it had almost grown wild and hairy, its outline lost. Most shocking of all, 2 long, undisciplined arms had grown out from shoulder height, with open fingers and hanging sleeves. Tolly was seized with panic and ran as fast as he could over the icy slopes to find Boggis. Boggis was whitewashing the little saddle room where he kept his blue teapot and mug and his Primus stove. Today he had a little fire in the grate. His face looked redder and his eyes bluer than ever, and the whitewash had a comforting, homely smell. Can't do nothing outside today, he said. I've made a fire so we can have our dinner cosy like, seeing as you're alone. At each side of the grate, old horseshoes were hanging, arranged in overlapping rows to make a sort of frame for it. They were all different, as if one had been kept from each horse that had lived there. Boggis had whitewashed the wall and had hung them all back on their nails. Tolly studied them with interest. How they varied. Some were obviously cart horses and some ponies, but in between were the carriage horses and the hunters, the thoroughbreds. One perhaps was Feste's. Is there among horseshoes one that stands out for its delicate curve, suggesting the perfect hoof, the sure and dancing step? Tolly thought so. He chose out one shoe for his love, and when Boggis was not looking, he wrote in the clean circle of wall behind it, Feste. Boggis, he asked presently, have you got a grandson? I had, but he was killed in the last war. Well, have you got a son? I had, too, but they were killed in the first war. Tolly was upset by this news. How would anything go on if there wasn't a Boggis? Then he remembered that he was only there himself, as it were, sideways through his mother. Well, haven't you a granddaughter then? Oh, yes, I have, and she's got a son. But he won't be called Boggis. Oh, yes, he will that. Oh, well, then that's all right. No, it isn't all right. It's all wrong, because she wasn't married. But there must be a Boggis, mustn't there? Well, Master Toseland, I shouldn't say so, least of all to you, but I do like to think Licorice, and what sort of name is that? Boggis guffawed, rocking on his heel. Percy Licorice, that's what he'd have been, and his mother's a good girl, barring accidents. Boggis spread newspapers on the table for a cloth, and sent Tolly to fill the kettle and to fetch the sandwiches that Mrs. Oldknow had put ready for him. They sat down one each side of the blue teapot. Boggis hung his cap on the point of a horseshoe. His bald scalp was as white as a hard-boiled egg above his scarlet face. He made the tea, taking the tea leaves from his waistcoat pocket. Sugar was in the pocket on the other side. He slipped the spoon straight into it, so it was unlikely that he had taken the sugar lump put out for Feste. Tolly thought his own sandwiches were so much nicer that it was embarrassing. His were ham, and then cheese and lettuce, and afterwards banana. Boggis had slabs of bread and mustard-coloured pickle. He refused to any exchange with scorn. I like something you can taste, he said. These pickled onions eat lovely. Did you know my grandfather? Said Tolly as they munched. That he did. He was a limb of mischief, he and his brothers. There were 6 of them. I remember one day they were all in that field there at the back looking for mushrooms. The bull had been put out with the cows and the boys hadn't noticed till all of a sudden he was well nigh snorting up their trousers. I seed them all run for the river and pop in one after the other, swimming with all their clothes on like so many frogs. I couldn't help but laugh. My son was Batman to your grandfather in the First War. They were killed together. In the Second War, it was my grandson as was the sergeant, and your father was his corporal. He carried my grandson across an open bridge when his legs were shot off. That's how he came here and met your mother, Miss Linnet. He came to see me and bring my grandson's things and tell us about him. Tell me about my mother. Oh, she was a proper caution too. Many a time she made me laugh. She did say such things. I remember once when she was only a little thing, she said to me, Boggis, she said, are you as red all over as your face is? She did. Are you as red all over as your face? No, Miss Linnet, I said. I'm as white all over as my head is, and I pulled my cap off to show her. How I did laugh. Boggis's tales were not nearly as good as Mrs. Oldknow's. The queer thing was that the nearer to the present they were, the more remote they seemed. Tolly was far more interested in Toby than he was in his father as the corporal. After lunch, he wandered back to the house. It seemed very empty without Mrs. Oldknow, as though not only had she gone, but all the possibilities of the house had gone with her. Even the picture looked different, and Tolly was almost surprised to see that the children's grandmother was still there. On the table lay the 2 magazines that had been brought in by Boggis. Tolly looked at them. One was called Here and There. There was a red pencil mark under the title, Homes the Crusaders left behind them. It was a long article, too full of historic references for Tolly to read, but it was illustrated with photographs of such houses as still existed, which Crusaders were known to have gone. Green Knowe was one of them, and there was a photograph of St. Christopher and an imaginary drawing of the chapel. The other magazine was called Adam's Seed. It was all about gardening, and the sender had marked with red pencil some unusual topiary. There were photographs of different things that had been cut out of yew and holly. Yew eagles, a yew ship, yew chessmen, crowns, arm, the hare, the cock, the hen, and Green Knowe. Photograph taken a long time ago because it showed Noah smaller and closely trimmed. Tolly began to read in earnest. Perhaps the most unusual and romantic of these examples is that of the Green Knowe, which now gives its name to the estate on which it stands, though the original name was Green Knowe. The story about it is widespread. It has been told to me in much the same form in different locales all over the county, and also still further afield, by old men who remember hearing it in their childhood. It seems that an old gardener called Boggis first shaped the various animals and later added a figure of Noah. He was much addicted to drink and suffered from delusions, but no one can deny his skill, and his employer appears to have allowed him to have a free hand. When Noah was a few years old and growing nicely, it happened that a famous horse thief was caught red-handed in the stables of Green Knowe, as it was still then called. Now we remember that story, don't we? He came up before the owner, Judge Old Knowe, for trial. He was condemned, and after lying in Newgate prison for some years, he was deported to Botany Bay, in Australia, for those of you listening in Australia. His mother, old Petronella, a notorious witch, is said to have revenged herself by breaking into the gardens during an eclipse of the moon, and there, with horrible dancing and laughter that was heard in the house, though no one knew what it was that so chilled their blood, she had laid a curse on the Green Knowe. The traditional version is, snip it, snap it, shapen you, devil's image take on you, evil grow, evil be, Green Knowe, demon tree. As the tree grew, a series of unexplained accidents overtook the men of the family, in every case due to the shying or bolting of horses. According to the villagers, the horses panicked because of a blind figure that prowled by night. Some say that old Petronella herself was caught by him in the end. Before long, the name Green Knowe was forgotten, the people insisting on calling it Green Knowe. The photograph that is reproduced here is at least 30 years old, as for a long time nobody has been willing to trim the old gentleman. It is hoped that in the end he will lose all resemblance and the curse will lapse. As Tolly finished reading the story, he suddenly realised that not only was Mrs. Old Knowe still away, but Boggis had finished his work and gone home. It was nearly dark, and he was alone. For some reason, he felt convinced that until his great-grandmother returned, not so much as a marble would move in the house. He felt no such assurance about the garden. He lit all the candles, made up the fire, laid out the tea, and sat down to wait in the ingle nook where once Toby had sat. He played sad little tunes on his flute with many wrong notes, and he wished with all his heart that she would come back. When at last he heard a car, he hurried to meet her. "I thought you were never coming," he said. Mrs. Old Knowe had masses of parcels and was laughing with pleasure. "Tolly, my dear, I've had a lovely day. I brought back the Christmas tree, and I've done some lucky shopping. Let's have tea at once, and I'll tell you all about it. Oh, darling, you've put everything ready." She seemed as pleased to be with him again as he was to be with her. They laughed as they ate. They found everything funny. They made silly remarks for the sake of laughing at them. She told him about an old friend whom she had met for lunch, who had grown a little queer in the head. She wore 2 hats and 2 wristwatches, neither of which would go, but she knows a lot of sporting people, and I believe I've got a partridge. I must ring it up an address she gave me tonight. If it's all right, we'll go together and choose a pear tree at the nursery gardens. The old nurseryman who has sold me garden things all his life will think I've gone mad at last when I say I want a 4-year-old pear tree and it must have branches strong enough to bear a partridge cage and partridge. You say it, Toby. It won't matter so much if you seem mad. You called me Toby, said Tolly, putting his arms round her neck from behind. Well, how can I tell which of you it is when you're behind me? Well, it's Tolly, unless Toby's in the same place as me, like Alexander. Well, if it's Tolly, you can tell me what you did all day. I had a picnic with Boggis. He keeps his tea in one waistcoat pocket and his sugar in the other. He just spoons the spoon straight in. Very convenient. My Boggis had a tailcoat with pockets in the tails. He had a bottle of beer in each and he kept his sandwiches in his hat. Boggis's were horrible yellow ones. Pickled onions, I expect, like his grandfather's. They would taste better with beer than with tea, but Boggis's grandfather drank so much beer that it's frightened his descendants ever since. They've all been teetotalers. That means they don't drink any alcohol at all. There was silence. And what else, my dear? Tolly noticed, when they were not talking, that the silence now had not that dead and frightening quality it had had when Mrs. Oldknow was away. He could not say whether he heard or only felt that the house was alive. Perhaps it was the wind, but there seemed to be a movement. A great deal was going on out of sight. He turned, comforted, to his great-grandmother. And what else, my dear? She repeated. These, said Tolly, handing her the magazines here and there and Adam's Seed. I read these. Mrs. Oldknow turned over the pages and soon came to the story of Green Knowe. She read it quickly while Tolly watched her face. Yes, she said. That's the end of the story of Ferdy the horse thief. I didn't want to tell you lest you should be frightened, but we leave Green Knowe alone and take no notice of him. He's growing into quite an ordinary tree. The curse is very old, and I suppose it doesn't last forever. Old Petronella and Ferdy died ages ago, and they don't care anymore. I only saw it this morning. Excuse me. I never noticed it before. It's so wild and uncut. Only it made a snowman. I know. I thought it hadn't eyes because no one could reach up to put the cinders in. Tolly couldn't help a shudder. Don't think about him. St. Christopher is much more lasting. Linnet's not afraid of anything, said Tolly, whose thoughts moved quickly from St. Christopher to Linnet and from Linnet to the owl. Perhaps Mrs. Oldknow's thoughts went the same way. How were the birds last night? She asked. Well, they made an awful mess, don't they know? It's surprising from such well-mannered little things. They don't know and they can't learn. You'll have to spread newspapers. It thawed this afternoon, but it's freezing again now. How the owls screamed last night. Tolly laughed, partly because he had been so frightened, partly with pleasure because the little birds had been so safe. I hope they screamed with rage, he said boldly. And that's where we'll leave them today, and we'll come back to them tomorrow. So goodbye for now from Green Knowe. Goodbye.